Welcome to Reality Therapy Corner. This is January podcast. We have with us Libby Murdoch, who is certified in choice theory and reality therapy. She's a licensed professional counselor. She's an international trainer, published author, known for her deep-rooted passion for brain science and brain-based intervention. So her expertise is in high demand with a specialization in trauma responsive care, resilience, relationships, and self-care. She owns Brain-Based Counseling and Consulting, LLC, and she offers personalized therapy and transformative EMDR intensives. So we welcome Libby. Please share any additional information you want, and the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, I just want to start by saying thank you, Vicki, for having me here. It's such an honor and a pleasure for us to reconnect because I think about, kind of my journey to where I sit today, and getting certified in choice theory and reality therapy was actually one of the first things I did. So I'm so glad that we got to meet, through that process, and that we've stayed connected. So thanks again for having me today. Awesome. Well, y'all, I'm going to actually start by sharing my screen because I put together a little bit of a presentation here, just so then we would have some different things that we could kind of focus on during our time together. It always helps me to have something visual, so I hope that's helpful for you all as well. So as Vicki mentioned, I'm Libby Murdoch. And I'm going to talk about the neurobiology of choice theory and reality therapy today. So just a little bit about me. As Vicki said, I'm certified in choice theory and reality therapy. I actually did that as I was going through my master's program. And I'm so glad that I did, because really everything that has come since then, I kind of view that through that lens of choice theory and reality therapy. But since getting certified in choice theory, I've also been trained in EMDR, and I'm certified as a clinician in EMDR, which for anyone who's not familiar, that stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And I loved EMDR so much, I became a client, I became a clinician, and now I'm actually a trainer of EMDR with my own recently approved model for teaching basic EMDR to other clinicians. So pretty excited about that. I'm also a certified clinical trauma professional. I really specialize in complex and developmental trauma. And then I've gotten certified in heart math for stress and anxiety. You might call that biofeedback, because that's essentially what heart math is. Again, Vicki already mentioned that I've done some publishing along the way. I have my private practice that's based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, where I offer EMDR intensives. And people hear that word intensive and they always think that it means that you're working on the deepest, darkest stuff. Not necessarily true. Really, when you think about doing an intensive, it's about the amount of time that you spend with a clinician. Because I am a trainer and, I have so many things going on with my schedule, I just don't do regular weekly therapy. I do more intensives where I spend kind of chunks of times with clients, and that allows us to get kind of more done in a shorter amount of time because we spend 3 hours together, or like tomorrow and the following day, I have a day and a half intensive where I'll spend about 9 hours with a client over the period of a day and a half. So it's pretty cool. And then here recently, actually just the year before last, I launched brain-based EMDR training. And now I'm kind of promoting my resilience-focused EMDR basic training. So that's kind of where I've been, what I've been up to. But let's talk about really what we're here to talk about today. And so if I had to kind of give, 3 objectives for what I would love for you to take from our time together. First is to understand the relationship between the basic needs that William Glasser identified and our brain's neurochemicals. And our brain's neurochemicals are really influential in terms of our feelings and our behavior. So we'll talk about that. And then I would also love it if you could walk away kind of recognizing the importance of choice and regular action for well-being. So we're going to actually talk about, again, the science behind that. And then finally, you'll learn one way that you can use the imagination to support people in meeting their basic needs. So I'll take you through a guided visualization, and that will correlate with one of the 5 basic needs. So my philosophy here is that a simple idea can create so much change. Doesn't have to be a complex idea, Doesn't even have to be a new idea, right? So that's kind of my approach to therapy and training in general, is that, I take a lot of really complex concepts from different trainers and I bring them all together and I synthesize them, right? I see how they all connect and then I simplify them. I bring them down to a level where really anybody could have a conversation about these things. And I think it is really helpful to have these conversations. But why? Why do we have conversations about brain science? And especially simplifying the brain science, because that, some scientists may take issue with how we're simplifying things. Well, first and foremost, we simplify it because it's easier for us to understand and apply, right? It doesn't feel like it's going over our heads. The second reason we talk about and simplify brain science is it can actually normalize our experience. And when it normalizes our experience, that can really be validating and shame reducing, right? And then the final reason we would do it is because it's educational and it's empowering, right? Like as a clinician, as someone who works with people, I ask people to do things all of the time. But I find that when I'm able to educate them about kind of the science behind what I'm asking them to do, it kind of increases their buy-in, right? And their motivation to do the thing that I'm asking or expecting of them. So those are just some different reasons why we might simplify and talk about brain science. And I want this to feel interactional. Again, I do have, information I want to share with y'all today, but if at any point you want to jump in, you have a thought, a comment, or a question, again, this is intended to feel like a conversation. I just wanted to have some slides and some information to kind of guide our interaction today. So before we kind of get into the brain science, I would, also like to remind you and encourage you to remember that all of the models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So when it comes to the brain, the body, the nervous system, we are really oversimplifying something that's very complex and something that we're still learning about all the time, right? So when it comes to what we talk about here today, I would just invite you to take what's helpful and leave the rest on the cutting room floor. So out of the 10 axioms of choice theory, I got to go on and review those last night. I kind of want to hone in on 2 of the 10 axioms. And the first axiom I really want to focus on is that we are driven by 5 genetic needs: survival, love and belonging, power, freedom, fun. And so today we're going to get a sneak peek into that, right? We only have an hour. So I can't lie to y'all. Last night I was like, oh my God, there's so many other things that I want to put in here, but we only have an hour. So just know that there's really more that you could expand and talk about in these areas, but we'll have to kind of limit it just due to the nature of time. And then the second axiom we're going to focus on is that behavior, which we know as total behavior, is chosen, and we have control over acting and thinking. And this is where I'm going to introduce some new information that might kind of challenge you to think beyond kind of the 10 axioms, because I would argue that we can also influence the way that we're feeling. And we're actually going to test that together today. So just a reminder, right? As if you all need a reminder of our 5 basic needs. But again, generally, we're looking at survival, we're looking at love and belonging, we're looking at power, freedom, and fun. And again, there are so many different ways that these 5 basic needs show up in, things like resilience factors, protective factors. And I can't wait until I have a setting where we have a little bit more time so that I can go deeper into how these 5 basic needs connect with so many of the things that we're looking at in terms of resilience and recovery. But for today, we're just going to keep it simple, and we're going to kind of start with our inner mammal. So I'm going to walk y'all through the hand brain, and you're welcome to join me. If you want to join me, you can just hold your hand up like you're going to wave. And this may be something you later decide to use with clients. But if you touch your forearm, that actually represents your spinal cord. If you touch the palm of your hand, that actually represents your brainstem. And your brainstem is responsible for all the things you don't want to think about: your heart rate, your blood pressure, your digestion. That's all here in our brainstem. If we fold the thumb over your palm, that's actually going to represent the limbic system. This is the seat of emotion and motivation. And together, this limbic system and your brainstem, those are your survival centers. right? So things going on down here in the survival centers, those are beyond conscious thought control, okay? This is there to keep you alive. If you fold your fingers down over your thumb, that's actually going to represent your cortex, or what we might refer to as the thinking brain, because this is the only part of our brain that we have direct thought control of, okay? Now, it's really interesting because as someone who is experienced in trauma and working with trauma treatment, you might find that a lot of the interventions that we use when we're working with trauma really engage the thinking brain, right? Like I would say a lot of our choice theory, reality therapy conversations, right? They engage the thinking part of the brain. But would you guess where trauma is actually stored, or what part of the brain trauma changes? Any ideas? Here in the downstairs brain, right? In those survival centers. So if you have trauma, it changes this part of the brain and it can actually kind of get stuck in this part of the brain. So that's why with my approach, I like to have interventions that are what we would refer to as top down. Things like choice theory, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? Where we're really engaging that thinking brain and then we're working our way down. And I also like to have strategies that are what we call bottom up, right? Which means that I'm going to the brain right where the brain has been affected by that trauma memory. And then I'm working to help to integrate this stuff that's here in the survival center into the thinking regions of the brain, right? So EMDR is actually an example of a more bottom up intervention that I use in my work with clients, whereas choice theory is more of my top down. So I think it's good to kind of have a both and, right? Like there's no territory on healing. So a lot of different modalities can kind of come together to create kind of that ultimate growth and healing experience for our clients. So let's take that a little further. Let's go back to the brainstem and let's talk about it. Your brainstem might also be referred to as your reptilian brain. No, you do not have a gecko living in your brain, right? It's just a metaphor to help us kind of understand what the brainstem does in terms of its function. And just like we were talking about, basic arousal, right? Bladder and bowel, blood pressure, breathing. Here's the really fun fact though. Remember, things happening here in those survival centers happen in 14 milliseconds, right? So if a bear walked into your office right now, it would take your brain only 14 milliseconds to categorize and react to that information. That's like faster than the blink of an eye. But y'all, conscious thought, the stuff happening up here in the thinking brain, that takes 400 to 500 milliseconds, right? So when you think about survival, again, the idea that a bear could walk into your office, do you really have 400 to 500 milliseconds to think about it? Like, I wonder, is that a brown bear or is that a black bear? No, you need to react, right? You need to go into that place of survival. And we'll talk about the different survival responses here in a minute. But first, I want to do something a little bit fun, and I want to test your brainstem to see how well it's working for us here today. So we'll play this little video clip as long as it's working, and then we'll talk about it. This is always fun in person, especially when this is up on like a big screen and you got a room full of people. But again, you knew what was going to happen when I started playing that video. In fact, it actually says right at the top, super long snake attacks camera, right? So I wasn't, I wasn't pulling the wool over your eyes, so to speak. But some people, when watching this video, even though they know logically this is a video of a snake and she's trying to get me to have a reaction to this snake video, regardless of knowing that, a lot of people, when they see that snake come towards the camera, they'll jump, right? They'll have some sort of a startle response. And again, that's kind of showing you the power of your survival brain, right? You can know something logically, but it doesn't mean that your survival brain isn't going to do what it's created to do. All right, so come into that limbic system. This we might refer to as, kind of that squirrel brain or more of that mammalian brain. This is the seat of emotion and motivation. And there's not true consensus on the different parts of the brain that make up the limbic system, but these are parts of the brain that are generally associated with the limbic system. So things like the hippocampus, and this part of our brain is responsible for memory, learning. It also tracks time, and it's constantly scanning our environment for threat. You also have the amygdala, which this is our system's alarm bell, right? So when there's emotionally charged or negative stimuli, our amygdala is going to react and kind of start that fight or flight response. We also have the hypothalamus. This regulates hunger and sex drive and makes oxytocin. And then we also have our pituitary gland that makes endorphins and triggers the release of our stress hormones. Things like, and excuse me, here it says oxytocin, but our stress hormones would be things like cortisol, adrenaline, right? Those are the things that would be triggered during the stress response. All right. And again, just as a friendly reminder, the limbic system, this is the part of the brain where trauma and trauma memories are going to get stuck. Actually, interestingly enough, if you're going through life and you have some sort of a traumatic experience, once your brain has detected that there is something dangerous or life-threatening, it's really interesting to know that this part of the brain, the hippocampus, which is responsible for forming a narrative memory and tracking time, it actually goes offline. Right? And this helps us to understand and explain why people who've been through traumatic situations, they don't make the best witnesses, right? That's because their brain wasn't storing a narrative memory, right? It wasn't storing, I was walking down the street and then a car came off from the left-hand side and, hit me, right? It's not remembering a narrative. Once it goes into that trauma response, that part of the brain is going dark, right? So it's not recording a normal memory. It's not even tracking time. What it is paying attention to, your five senses. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you smelling? What are you tasting? What are you touching? Right? Because your system is thinking, if you get out of here, I'm never letting this happen to you again. Right? And so those five senses, whatever input was coming in, that's what your brain is going to hold on to. And those things are later going to become your triggers, right? The way that your brain is trying to help you avoid running into a similar situation in the future. Now we're coming back around to the cortex. And again, if you were going to use the hand brain, you can show that we have a left and right hemisphere. And our left hemisphere, later to develop, it's linear, it's logical, like it likes cause and effect relationships. It likes lists, like the one I'm making right now, as Dan Siegel would say. It's also very language based and it likes explanations, right? Whereas the right hemisphere, earlier to develop, more holistic, it's visual spatial, meaning that it just takes things as they are. It's nonverbal signals, and it has an integrated map of the body, right? So that's kind of the differences that we might see between the left and right hemispheres. We need both to be happy and healthy and well integrated. The other thing that's important to kind of reference when we talk about the thinking brain or the cortex is actually the two middle fingers of this top layer, which we would refer to as the prefrontal cortex. Now, why is the prefrontal cortex important? Well, it's important because it's responsible for the development of this thing we call executive function. And executive function is really a fancy way to say all of the skills that we need to literally survive in the world that we live in, right? Things like impulse control, things like flexible thinking, things like doing a task that requires more than one step, being able to plan and start that task, right? All of those things are part of executive function. Research is now telling us executive function isn't actually fully formed until we're in our early 30s, right? So that's something that, kind of progresses over time. The other thing to note is that traumatic experiences can impact the development of executive function, right? Which is how you can have a grown adult that you may expect should be able to use a planner or show up somewhere on time, but they're not able to, right? That may actually be a sign that their executive function has been impacted by their life experience. All right. So when looking at the brain, like how does our nervous system, how does our brain decide how to respond to something that's potentially threatening in our environment? And I was actually watching this really cool video on YouTube, and it was by Stephen Porges's son. So it was actually really cool to hear Stephen Porges's son talking about kind of the polyvagal theory. Anyway, he said you can kind of think of like an upside down stoplight. So when you're in green, this is safety, right? And we are engaging at that point our parasympathetic nervous system. And how you can remember that is it's relax, digest, social mode, right? So when we're in the green, we're feeling good, we're feeling groovy, we can learn, we can have fun with people, we can interact, right? That's when we've got a green light. But when there's danger, when it hits a yellow light, this is when I turn into Steve Irwin, right? Danger, danger, right? Because when there's danger, you are going to engage the sympathetic part of your nervous system. This is a part of your nervous system you don't have direct thought control of. And this is where the fight or flight reaction is going to come from, right? And it's really fight to flee or flight, right? Because if you've ever watched National Geographic, how often does the prey turn to face the predator, right? It's really often when they've got no other choice that they're going to do that. So it's really fight to flee or just flee, because if at all possible, we will get the heck out of Dodge, right? But if your nervous system reads a situation and it decides it's not safe, it's not even dangerous, it's actually life threatening, you will actually engage the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system at the same time, and they will come on so hard that we actually go into freeze, submit, collapse, shutdown, right? This is where we could literally lose the ability to leave a situation, right? So I think about when I think about this particular piece of the equation, I think about my clients who've maybe been victims of sexual abuse or sexual assault, right? And how their brain could have possibly read that type of situation as life-threatening. And even though all they probably wanted to do was to fight or to flee, they weren't able to do that, right? And how that could affect them, to think that they somehow made this choice, right? Which we know and are learning right now isn't actually a choice, right? Like you don't get to decide what survival response you're going to have in the moment. Your survival brain makes that choice for you, and it does it in 14 milliseconds, which is faster than you can even really think about what's going on in that situation, right? And this system is there to keep us alive, right? So, hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but our brain evolved to promote survival, not to make us feel good. And with that in mind, how does the brain define survival? I don't know if y'all love travel, but if you are into traveling and you love nature, I highly, highly recommend, if at all possible, take a trip to Central America. These pictures are actually pictures that my husband and I took in Panama, in Central America. We went on the Panama Canal and did like a little boat ride, and you got to go up to these different islands. And these monkeys, they recognize these boats coming, right? So as you're approaching Monkey Island, you've got all these monkeys just in the trees waiting for the boats to come closer. And that's for two reasons, right? It's the survival, things that keep us alive, right? Like this little tamarin monkey that you see there. He's actually eating a banana out of my husband's hand, right? But the second way that the brain defines survival is in this second picture, things that keep the species alive, right? So this mother is finding food for herself, but she's also finding food for her baby, right? Because that's going to keep the species alive. And it's very simplistic, right? How our brain defines survival. So, moral of the story here, we're not designed to be happy all the time because that would be bad for survival. Instead, we have a system that's going to turn on good feelings in short bursts to motivate us towards rewards and turn on unpleasant feelings to motivate us to avoid threat, right? This here to me is what connects with what William Glasser discovered about the need to take action, right? Because our nervous system, the way that it works, we're not supposed to just feel good all the time. We have to take action to trigger what we can kind of refer to as happy chemicals that are going to make us feel good, right? Because we've done something that's fruitful for our survival. And interestingly enough, those neurochemicals correlate with those 5 basic needs that William Glasser identified. What's it like to have this information, that there's actual science behind this idea that you have to take action in order to feel good? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I got a couple of things here. Dr. Glasser says that our behavior is based upon wanting to satisfy happiness or pleasure, which, and we're talking about survival here. I would be happy to survive.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great question. And there's actually an overlap between survival and pleasure. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second, especially when it comes to our neurochemicals. So absolutely. Yeah. In fact, let's just get into it, because this kind of, you're leading us right into our next discussion. So dopamine, this is a neurochemical and it represents I can do it, right? That's the sensation of dopamine. Dopamine is going to motivate you to meet your needs, and you also have to do more to get more. Now, I've actually added symbols on this page to represent the basic needs that dopamine would correlate with. Number one, it's going to correlate with survival for the 2 reasons that we just saw right here. Things that keep us alive and things that keep the species alive are going to trigger the release of dopamine, right? When we complete a task that moves us closer to a goal, we're going to get dopamine, right? Which we could correlate with kind of the power need in the 5 basic needs. But we also get dopamine from other places. And a great example of this is, in terms of how we correlate that with pleasure, is when you think about dessert, right? So if you ask someone, why do you have dessert? What do you think they're going to say?
Because it tastes good.
Because it tastes good. Because it tastes good. Yeah. Why do you think we have things like beer? Is that because it tastes good?
Did you say fear or beer?
Beer. Yep, beer. Like you'd have a drink, a beer.
It doesn't make you feel good.
Okay, because it makes you feel good, right? I think you just hit the nail on the head, Michael, because we know that things like our favoriteest junk foods, chocolate, M&Ms at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, even though you just ate lunch, a coffee in the morning, even though you just had breakfast, or the beer at the end of the day, that is actually triggering the release of dopamine. And those things that provide us pleasure, they actually quickly and reliably trigger that release of dopamine, maybe even more so than those things that are associated with our survival. So now we kind of start to get into kind of the discussion of how do things like dependencies develop, right? Because we could even say all of the drugs of abuse are going to trigger dopamine, which is the feel-good chemical, right? But substance of abuse triggers so much dopamine release, right, that it doesn't quite compare to brushing your teeth or getting a drink of water or those fundamental things that we do to keep ourselves alive. So therein kind of lies the overlap. Yeah. Anything coming up for you there, Michael, when we start to talk about dopamine and kind of the overlap between survival and pleasure?
No, I'd like you to go back and over that again, just briefly, the last part of what you said, because my own thinking got in the way of what you were saying.
Yep. So essentially, like things that create pleasure for us, our favorite junk food, playing video games, when someone likes my post on social media, or even if I had a beer, right? Those things trigger the release of dopamine,
Right.
but they trigger the release of dopamine in such a big way that it's actually even more, it creates even more of a dopamine release than maybe the basic things we do for survival, right? So I need water to survive, right? So when I take a drink of water, my brain rewards me with dopamine because that's good. That keeps me alive. But if I take a drink of beer, although, beer isn't necessarily required for my survival, it's actually going to release more dopamine than it did when I took the drink of water. Yeah. So we know, that things that people have a propensity to develop dependencies on, or maybe even you could use the term addiction, right? Those trigger dopamine in a big way that is so reliable and consistent that that is how the dependency would then develop, right? Is because our brain enjoys dopamine. When we get dopamine, that encourages us to keep doing a thing, right? And it makes us feel good. So when the brain finds something that quickly and reliably releases a lot of dopamine, we want to keep doing that thing, even if it's not necessarily good for us, right?
It's short-lived, so you have to keep doing it.
You got it, right? And actually, when you think about substances of abuse, like if I were to give you a Hershey kiss, because that's what I like to do, you know, when we're in person, I would increase the dopamine levels in your brain. I think it's, let me actually just look it up real quick because I want to make sure I'm giving you the correct data. So chocolate will increase the dopamine level in your brain 150%, just if I gave you a Hershey kiss. If I gave you something like powdered cocaine, the dopamine level in your brain rises 300%. But if I give you something like crack, it's 1000%. And methamphetamine is a 2000% increase, right? So it's interesting, again, that some of the things that produce big levels of pleasure.
How do they measure that?
How are they measuring that? That's a
How
great
do they measure dopamine?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not necessarily sure how they were measuring that in that study, but that is a great question. I can certainly look into that. Yeah, but that's kind of the information, right? Is that again, dopamine, which is a neurochemical that our brain is going to release anytime we do anything for our survival, anytime we take a step closer to a goal, or anytime we do something that's going to create pleasure for us, right? Dopamine is going to be released in the brain, right? That's kind of the feel-good neurochemical. So let's talk about a few other neurochemicals. Serotonin. Serotonin is the sense that I will get the banana, right? So serotonin is actually the pleasure of social dominance, not social aggression. And a great example that I have of this, if you've ever been like at family game night and there's like one slice of pizza left and you and your cousin like dive for it at the same time, that's serotonin, right? Because the sense here is, hey, I'm safe here. I can assert myself and I can take that last slice of pizza, right? It signals that it's safe to assert yourself and meet your needs, which we could then correlate again with the basic needs of survival, but also power, right? This is the sense that, again, there is social dominance here. It's okay for me to take what I need, right? Which again, helps keep us alive. This is a feel-good chemical. So we feel good when we get that serotonin release. We've also got oxytocin. This is the sense that we trust each other, safety in numbers, as well as access to resources, because at the end of the day, we're just mammals, right? Oxytocin is stimulated by touch, and it promotes nurturing in children and bonding in couples, right? So we could correlate oxytocin with the need for survival, because again, things that keep us alive and the species alive, mating, right, is one of those things that keeps the species alive and one of the reasons that we would release oxytocin. But also, again, bonding, things like cuddling, things like petting your dog, right? Those release oxytocin, and that helps to meet our need for love and belonging, right? But you got to do more to get more. That's kind of the moral of the story here. Opioids are another happy chemical. It's kind of the sense that I'm not feeling the pain. And you're like, Libby, why are we looking at a picture of a lion attacking the zebra and you're telling me that this is a happy chemical? Well, the reason this is a happy chemical is because when we have opioids, when those are released in the brain, it actually buffers stress, reduces pain, and produces pleasure. So I should actually have our one for fun on here as well. Because opioids include things like endorphins. So right now, this zebra that's being attacked by the lion, its brain is releasing endorphins with the intention to buffer the stress and reduce the pain so that the zebra has a will to survive, right? So that it's not so overwhelmed by the pain that it just gives up. But that's not the only way we get endorphins, y'all. When you exercise, you get endorphins. When you laugh, you get endorphins, right? So again, opioids, which are a feel-good chemical, kind of the I'm not feeling the pain, I'm feeling pleasure, we could correlate that with both the survival need and we could also correlate with the fun, right? Because when you think about belly laughing with your friends at a joke, well, that's kind of a fun thing to do, right? And that gives us access to endorphins, which are going to help us feel good. Just like if we exercise, although I'm not going to lie, it feels pretty painful sometimes when I'm at the gym, right? You do feel good generally after you've done some sort of exercise. Also, another fun fact, even just 15 to 20 minutes of aerobic exercise is equivalent to a dose of antidepressants, even in adults.
How many minutes?
15 to 20.
That's what I thought you said.
Yep,
Oh
just
my
15 to
God.
20 minutes. Yeah, so it doesn't even take long. This neurochemical, this is an unhappy chemical. So this is do something now, and this is cortisol. Let me be clear here. Cortisol isn't all bad, okay? Cortisol is what got us all out of bed this morning. But cortisol, if there's too much of it, it can actually damage really important areas of the brain that are involved with things like language and learning and memory. So cortisol is going to alarm you when you're isolated, disappointed by a lack of rewards, in a weaker social position, or your survival is threatened, right?
Welcome to my world.
Exactly, exactly. But this gives us a way to reframe it. Like, I don't know, but when I think about failure, I'm like, oh, that is literally just a cortisol release because I was disappointed by a lack of rewards. Right? It doesn't necessarily make you feel better, but it does kind of help you to understand what's going on there. So we could correlate this with the need for survival. I would also even argue we could probably correlate this with love and belonging, right?
Mhm.
Because it's going to alarm you when you're isolated.
That's my world, yeah.
Let me
Yeah.
ask you a question about the cortisol then.
Sure.
You said it, and I was trying to write it down. So when I fail at something, if I reframe it to that's just an overload of cortisol releasing because I was expecting, and then fill in the blank.
Yeah.
I hear you right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can literally do that, right? That you can reframe when something doesn't go well. Again, that this feeling that I'm having is just a cortisol release because I'm disappointed maybe by the outcome of
So
what's
does it,
here.
yeah. So does that help in my need to feel power within myself that I have understanding?
What do you think?
That's where I went with that
Yeah.
statement. And the way I was thinking is that we could add power, a sense of freedom because I understand.
Yeah.
It
That it
makes
might be,
sense.
yeah, that it might be empowering for a client to
Empowering.
understand that these feelings are because of a cortisol release because one of these things has happened.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. So, because we're hardwired for survival, our brains and bodies are designed to be shaped by and for our environments, relationships, and experiences. And this is normally where I would go into memory and how adaptive, healthy, positive neural networks develop, but also maybe how neural networks that contribute to illness or mental health, how those also develop. But again, we don't have time for that today. So I'll just kind of leave you with something that I talk about a lot when it comes to trauma training, which is this idea that it's actually not what's wrong with you, right? That's the question that we ask for far too long, and it's not the right question. It's actually what happened to you. That's the question we need to start asking people.
Love that.
And what did you have to do to survive, right? Because it's often the answer to that third question. That answer to that question is what brings them into the office, right? To end up seeing us, what they had to do to survive. So with that in mind, I want to focus on what I like to call the silver lining. And this is the idea that the brain is capable of change, right? So we've kind of talked about, again, that idea that, William Glasser hit the nail on the head when he expected people to take action. And we discovered how those different neurochemicals are going to release when we take action, and they can actually make us feel good, right? And then we also discussed how each of those neurochemicals can be correlated with each of those 5 basic needs. So we're coming back around to this idea of taking action again with the silver lining, because what we know is that the brain is capable of different types of change. The first type of change is neurogenesis. And when you hear that, I just want you to think new, because that means that your brain can literally create new connections. Might even be doing that right now as you're listening to this presentation. The second type of brain change is what we would refer to as neuroplasticity. And when you hear that, you can just think plastic, because it means that we can change already existing networks in the brain. Very, very important when it comes to the work I do with EMDR, right? Because when I'm helping someone heal from their trauma, I'm harnessing the power of neuroplasticity. And then finally, the last way the brain can change, it's this idea that if you don't use it, you lose it. Didn't exactly work that way for Steve Carell in The 30-Year-Old Virgin, but that is the way it works when it comes to our brain, folks, right? So EMDR, which is again a modality that I use, is going to promote neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. I would argue that choice theory likely also promotes at least neurogenesis, if not also neuroplasticity, which is changing existing networks in the brain. We're definitely going to be building new pathways with choice theory and reality therapy. So where do our neural pathways come from? And again, if we had more time, we would dive so deep into this, but just in the interest of time, we're going to focus on 2 out of 3 of these: repetition and emotion. But in general, our neural pathways are built from repetition, emotion, and youth. So another way you could say that is that neurons that fire together wire together, which is Hebb's axiom. Dan Siegel puts that another way. He says where attention goes, neural firing flows and neural connection grows. Love him. He's so wonderful. And if you're of my generation and you love listening to hip hop music and rap, you may be familiar with this lyric from Lil Wayne, that repetition is the father of learning, right? So all that to say that repetition is one of those ways that we build new neural pathways with our client. It's actually how a state becomes a trait, is practice over time, right? So when we're consistently asking our clients to take action, we are helping them build pathways, and we may even be helping them create new states and traits, right? And a state is something that you have to take a lot of energy and intention, right? Might be like learning to play the piano or learning to play the guitar. But eventually, when you've practiced that a lot over time, it's easy. You barely even have to think about it. It becomes more of a trait than a state, right? We can do that same thing with our clients, whether it's, helping them to develop the state of reaching out for connection to meet their basic needs, or help them to develop the state of taking action toward a goal that they have for themselves. If we can get them to do that repeatedly over time, we can help that go from something that takes a lot of intention and energy to something that is a little bit less involved of a process for them. It's easier. So now we're going to kind of go into that area where I'm maybe going to challenge just a little bit some of the traditional idea with choice theory and reality therapy. Because I would say, and again, this is maybe stepping away from this idea that like thoughts are the primary drive of all of our behavior. I would actually say that we are feeling creatures that think, not thinking creatures that feel. And this is kind of agreeing with something that came from Jill Bolte Taylor. She has a TED Talk called My Stroke of Insight. If you haven't seen that TED Talk, it's actually really interesting because she is a brain scientist who then had a stroke. And so she did a TED Talk on what it was like to know as a brain scientist what was happening in her brain, but to also be a human going through a very human experience of having a stroke. But this was my big takeaway. We are feeling creatures that think, not thinking creatures that feel. And so let's play with that for a second. I want to ask you all a question. The last time you were hungry, did you think it or did you feel it first?
Thought it first.
Yeah. The last time you had to go to the bathroom, did you think it or feel it first?
I felt it.
Bingo, right? So we think a lot about, thoughts as a primary driver, but I would suggest that there's motion in emotion, right? That even if you break down the word emotion, it's evoking motion, right? But one of the things that William Glasser had kind of talked about was that it's more challenging for us to influence those feelings. And I'm going to talk about how we might be able to do that here in a minute. Really quickly, this is kind of some cool information to know. There are actually consequences to avoiding our emotions. When you look at the research tells us that typically an emotion, we just allow ourselves to experience it when it comes up, it's going to last roughly 90 seconds. But if we do what, culture, right, might teach us to do, avoid it, push it down, pretend like it's not affecting us. We've taken an emotion that could have been very temporary at somewhere around 90 seconds, and we've now turned it into a mood. Moods last days, weeks, months. We diagnose people with mood disorders, right? So it's a good thing to teach people how to not avoid, push down, or pretend, but really turn toward their emotional experiences. Which brings us to resourcing, right? This is the tool that I want you to be able to take away today. And a resource, at its most basic definition, is anything that can bring up a good feeling or sensation inside of a client. And so resourcing teaches a person that they're capable of creating good feelings and sensations, and that they can use that capacity to shift their internal experience from one that's unpleasant to one that's neutral or pleasant. So what does that look like? Well, one of the ways that we can do that and we can influence the way that we're feeling is very simple. It's called belly breathing. And so what are we doing here? Well, we're trying to breathe at a rate of 5 to 7 breaths per minute. So it's a very slow, intentional breath where we are inhaling through the nose, exhaling through the mouth, and that exhale is longer than the inhale. Right? Those are really the two keys to belly breathing, is that the air is going into the belly or the diaphragm, and that the exhale is longer than the inhale. And if I can get someone to breathe that way, 5 to 7 breaths per minute, the science tells me I can help them shift out of the part of their nervous system that they don't have thought control of, that fight or flight, and I can help to get them into that relax and digest part of the nervous system. And there's other science behind mindfulness, which is actually what I'm describing now, which is paying attention to your breathing. And of course, when you're doing that, you have focused attention over the breath. You also have open awareness of anything that might be coming up in your system, but you also need to be kind to yourself, right? When a thought or an emotion comes up, you just name it and then you refocus yourself on what you're focusing on, which is in this case, the breath. And if you're able to do that, if you have a 12-minute mindfulness practice each day that includes these 3 pillars, the research shows us that you can get the following outcomes. Neural integration, which is actually the definition of mental health. I don't know if y'all knew that or not. Neural integration, which is, again, the brain being able to do specialized tasks, but to be able to also come together to kind of coordinate what it's doing. It also reduces cortisol. It can enhance immune system function, reduce cardiovascular risk factors, reduce inflammation, even to the point of turning off the genes that are associated with certain autoimmune disorders. And it can actually slow the aging process because it helps to maintain telomerase, which is the stuff that's on the end of our chromosomes. And again, this isn't just any level of mindfulness. This is a 12-minute mindfulness practice each day. The research shows that you can get those outcomes. So let's talk about our first resource and the tool that I want you all to be able to take away from today. Any sort of resource that I do, I always do it in combination with the belly breathing, which is why I like to talk about that first. But this is the resource that you all will be able to take away, and you can use it with anyone that you'd like to after today. It's called Positive Relational Resources, and it's actually adapted from this thing called a positive relational moment, which was originally created by Amy Banks. So what is a positive relational resource? Well, it's any experience or memory of feeling safe or happy in a relationship. Any memory of mutual connection, could be receiving nurturance or support from others in hard times, feeling safe and protected, getting wisdom or guidance, greetings and reunions, affection, quality time, having a new experience or adventure together, shared memories, or developing a new relationship. Right? So, and I want to point something out here. With the most complex of clients, it may be positive relational moments with animals, right? Because we know oftentimes if someone has been really abused and neglected, relationships are something that make them kind of want to move away, right? So we can start to build that capacity for relational connection back again by focusing on their interactions and their connections with animals, right? if they don't have any positive relational moments with people. But a lot of times I find that clients do. In fact, my own personal example that I love to use for this resource, I like to call it the cuddle puddle. And
Oh,
it's on like a Saturday or a Sunday morning when my husband and I don't have to get up for work. So there's no alarm, thank God. And we like stay in bed, and we have 3 fur babies. We have a German short-haired pointer, a Pomeranian, and we have a Frenchie. And so we let all of our puppies climb into bed with us, and we all just cuddle, right? And that's our Saturday morning cuddle puddle. And when I think about that and I focus on it, actually, it's really neat because even just as I'm talking and describing it to you, I'm feeling chills in my body in a good way, right? So even just this idea that I can think about that the action that I could take could be bringing up a positive experience of something that I've had in relationship, and that could trigger those neurochemicals that we were just talking about by thinking or imagining an experience of connection with someone. So let's look at how we use this, right? And I'll kind of just invite you all to kind of go through the process. So if you feel comfortable, we can just start by just taking a few deep breaths in. I like to put my hand on my diaphragm because that always helps me to know that the air is going where I want it to go, but do it however it feels comfortable for you. And we're going to take a nice deep breath in together. And we're going to slowly exhale. We're going to take a nice deep breath in again. And exhale. We'll do that one more time. Nice deep breath in. And this time on that exhale, I just want you to think of what a positive relational moment would be for you. A memory of connection, could be a vacation you took with someone, a special memory with a person you love, or even a hard time where you remember that person really supporting you. But we'll take a nice deep breath in, and on that exhale, take yourself to that positive relational experience. And I want you to, in your mind, I want you to start developing that image, right? Like pay attention to, what am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I smelling? If there's a sensation of touch, what am I touching? And just notice, kind of take yourself back to being in that moment of positive connection. And just notice, again, what you're seeing and hearing and smelling, all of your 5 senses. And then once you're connected, maybe just take a second to check in with your body. You may check in with your chest. You may check in with your gut. You may check in with your muscles. But I want you to notice, how does thinking about that positive relational experience, how does that affect your emotions and sensations? And this is the point that, like, if I were working with a client, I'd be gathering feedback from them. Again, no obligation to share, since this is kind of more of like a group exercise, so to speak. If they had a positive response, I would actually begin to integrate that response with slow bilateral stimulation. And that's an EMDR term. When you think about bilateral stimulation, it's anything that crosses the midline. So when we're walking, that's actually bilateral stimulation. But this is also bilateral stimulation. So I would actually integrate and enhance whatever positive feelings they're having by inviting them to slowly tap for a few seconds as they focus on that positive relational resource that they've just developed. I then might add a cue word, so allow them to give me a word or a phrase that we would kind of connect with that. And then we would do some sort of closure, meaning that I would check in and say, hey, how did this go? What are you thinking? How might you use this moving forward? So I'd love to get some feedback from you all if you did decide to, go through that exercise as I walked you through the steps. What did you notice about your emotions or sensations when thinking about your positive relational resource? Anybody care to share?
I can. I was imagining snorkeling in the Grand Cayman Islands, and so I could actually sense it, smell it. I could feel it because I closed my eyes and really focused on it. A smile came across my heart, my face. So just a relaxation type thing. Wow.
Beautiful, right? So again, just by kind of choosing what you were focusing on there in that moment, you were able to shift your experience.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that's exactly the point, right? Is that actually what we could ask our clients to do or take action on would be something like this. Hey, what if you just took a few minutes out of your day and you focused on this memory of snorkeling with your friend in the Grand Cayman Islands? Or what if you just took a few minutes a day and, like for my example, focused on what it feels like when you're cuddling with your dog, right? And that could actually bring up good feelings for the client and begin to help them kind of shift and move forward, which is what we often see when they're taking action in EMDR, right? It's that action that helps them feel better. And when they're feeling better, things get a whole lot easier. Yeah. So that's kind of, what I have to offer today. I do have some different questions that we can kind of talk about it. Like, how do you think you might use the brain science that you learned today? How could you use it in relationship to the basic needs or in regards to the importance of taking action? Any thoughts or ideas about how you might just be able to use the brain science from today?
Do you have any future videos on this coming up on how to do those things, how it applies to clients?
Like, do I have any future trainings coming up on like the
No,
resourcing
I
stuff?
mean, for what we're doing today on this site, on this Zoom meeting.
So actually, and Vicky, am I allowed to share the coming preview of
Sure.
current events?
Sure.
So I'm actually happy to announce, Michael, I will be in Chicago at the conference this summer, and I will have a little bit longer to dive into this topic. So we'll be doing a keynote at the conference, the William Glasser Conference in July in Chicago.
Okay.
And I think if you Google any of, is it Spiegel's work? Dan Spiegel?
Dan Siegel?
Siegel. Mike, any that she's talking about, he would probably have some free videos out there. And I'm trying to think if there's any other resources that you were asking about.
Yeah, Dan Siegel's a great resource. There's also a woman, and I'll put their names in the chat like here in just a second, so then you can just copy that information. But the other person who a lot of this information came from is Loretta Bruning, and she actually has a website. It's called the Inner Mammal Institute. And what I love about Loretta is she puts all sorts of free PowerPoints on her website. So a lot of this information came from going through those PowerPoints and kind of self-guided learning about the things that she was teaching about. But I do have like my EMDR basic trainings where we go into this kind of brain science that we were today. We talk about how do our neural networks form, the healthy ones that allow us to do well in life, but also the maladaptive ones. And then you learn how to not only do like trauma processing, but you also learn a ton of other things about this relational resource stuff or just resourcing in general. Is also a part of something like that too. So, but yeah.
Mike, have you ever done any training with EMDR?
No, I haven't. I'm strictly a Glasser purist.
Okay.
Where everything is very simplistic, where this makes it very clinical, but the two fit together very well.
It
Yeah.
does. And I've gone through 2 trainings of EMDR. I never got interested in becoming certified, but I found that it worked very well with Glasser's work. And that's why I asked you if you had done any, because it's very interesting to learn about how the brain works. And one of the things that I took away from one of my trainings, one of the guys that was doing it, he said, folks, if you don't want to work after hours, if you don't want to deal with crises, if you don't want to, and at the time I was working in the community North Psych Pavilion. So I was working with the people that were in the worst state of mind that you could be in. And he said, if you don't like that kind of work, or you're not willing to work after hours, get out of this business. Don't do it, because this is where people need you on after hours and on weekends and when they're in a crisis.
For EMDR?
Well, he was talking about how that's when you do your best work. And I was in the hospital setting.
I gotcha.
So,
I gotcha.
in a hospital
Hospital setting.
setting.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, he was saying, look, if you don't, you know, he just really felt like we have to be able to be in tune with the client where they are, when they are in those moments.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it fits so well with the way Dr. Glasser, or how I learned Dr. Glasser's work through Bob Wobeldine and a few others.
Absolutely.
I would
Yeah.
encourage you, Mike, to look into it. I mean, I feel like I'm a purist too. This brain information though is so informative. I do want to say that we're a little bit after 2, so if you need to go, I understand. If you want to stay, feel free. And I don't know if Tom is still with us. If he
Oh,
wants,
yeah. Yeah, I'm
if,
here.
if you wanted to say anything or ask any questions.
No, I found it very interesting. Um, uh, I'm more like Michael in terms of being a Glasser purist.
Yep.
I used most of mine for people who did have childhood experiences that affected what they were doing.
Yes.
In terms of control, primarily control of other people.
Oh, yeah.
And I used that quite, you know, found out what was going on in the, had been going on in the youth that developed what they were using as adults. So I found that very informative.
Yeah. And I would agree with what y'all are saying, which is that, you know, I think the two could really kind of come very well together, because when I think about, you know, choice theory and reality therapy, and even those clients that we know have that trauma history, kind of what EMDR would say is that the challenges they're facing in the present moment are actually the result of the past showing up in the present. And if we can help them work through the past that's showing up in the present, you know, they're going to be able to go on and implement, right, like different skills or different things that we're teaching them, because the past may be the thing that's preventing them from taking action or doing the thing that they need to do in order to get better. So,
Well, I found that teaching choice theory, teaching the principles was very effective.
yeah,
Almost as a teacher,
right.
not as a therapist as much, but as a teacher, and showing how what happened in the past violated the principles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Absolutely.
And once they were violated, if you didn't violate them, then you could move on past and not need to have that control and that violence in your life
Yeah.
that you had experienced when you were younger.
Right. Yeah. Well, good stuff. Well, this is kind of what I had for y'all today. So just thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up. The QR code, you're welcome to scan that with your phone. That just takes you to a link tree. Like if you were interested in learning about my trainings or anything like that. And then right in front of you, you have my contact information, my email, a phone number that comes directly to my phone, and then the brain-based EMDR website where you're welcome to go if you want to learn more about resilience-focused EMDR basic training. So thanks again for your time, and thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Libby.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate everything you've